next candidate, Ryan, I want to talk about is Joe Brady. So this is not a just throwing him out there because he was at LSU thing. This is a name that I think is worth discussing for a number of different reasons, and someone who I've heard enough from enough people that he's at least someone I expect to be for Notre Dame to reach out to. I do know that Marcus Freeman does have a past relationship, not a working relationship, like they work together anywhere, but they know each other. And so he is a guy that I do expect Notre Dame to take a look at. Obviously, Joe Brady is the current quarterback's coach for the Buffalo Bills. He was the pass game coordinator, receivers coach for the LSU team in 2019. Had a lot to do with the quarterbacks. Before that, he was with Sean Payton for 2 years with the New Orleans Saints. He was at Penn State in 2015 and 2016. So, he's a guy that is a very interesting guy to discuss, Ryan. And we all know the reason he's on this list primarily, right? It's because of the success they had in 2 years or in his 1 year there at LSU, right? Where they won a national championship. So he's going to be a guy that people are going to talk about, but there's a reason for it. And some of the names being thrown around are just like, dude, that's pie in the sky stuff. Like that's kind of how David Shaw is. David Shaw is just a guy whose name gets brought up, and we respect his offensive mind a lot. And so we say, hey, if he wants him, but we're trying to be more serious with this, and guys we think are actually could be legitimate candidates if Notre Dame pursued them and defined some guys with connections. So I do think Joe Brady is a name to keep an eye on. Again, right now, there is no one guy, but if Joe Brady was willing to come back to college, I think he'd be a guy that Notre Dame would want to have a conversation with. But that right there is the question mark right now, Ryan, is does he want to come back to college?
I mean, obviously it's a massive question mark, right? I mean, we're talking about a guy that literally has been in the NFL since 2019, right? It's not like, he's showed an interest to go
and was
back.
There the 2 years before 2019. Right. Sorry, Ryan. But yeah, and was there the 2 years before 2019.
Now that was actually a perfect interruption, Brian, because I coughed. So it was fantastic. That. Good job on you, man.
Yes.
Yes. You're like telepathic. It was fantastic.
Well, it's just I interrupt you so much. It was bound to be at a perfect time, right? It's just law of averages.
That was the best interruption that you've ever had. But
thank you.
He's a really interesting coach, though, because like I said earlier on our previous podcast, 2019 was just such a fantastic job on his part, right? And you mentioned obviously the implication, the passing game was really where he was so influential, bringing some of that New Orleans Saints terminology and just kind of understanding route concepts, all that great stuff. And they went from a pretty average offense in 2018 to maybe the best offense we've ever seen, ever. Not even average, below average.
Not average. Because here's the thing people have to remember about that year, right? They averaged 32.8 points per game that year, the year before at LSU. And I already pointed out the stats earlier. He had Joe Burrow in his first year as a starter, which was his senior season, had 6 fewer touchdown passes than Drew Pine had a quarterback rating that was 20 points below Drew Pine's, had a completion percentage well below Drew Pine's, and averaged fewer yards per attempt than Drew Pine, with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Stephen Sullivan, Terrace Marshall on that roster. Yep. Everybody comes back the next year, and they go from what they were. But here's the other thing to consider about that team that averaged 32.4 points per game. They scored 72 points against Texas A&M in like 7 overtimes. And so even that number is inflated. And so it was really they were really sub that. And I think if I remember correctly, it was 24-24 at the end of regulation. Yes. Yeah. No, it was 10-17. It was 31-31 at the end of regulation. So if you take away the points that they had from that game and just look at what they had in regulation, LSU that year was averaging 29.2 points per game. To be sub 30 at a place like LSU or even Notre Dame is not an average offense. It's a below average offense.
Sure.
And, we talk about, the issues we had with Notre Dame this year and how their offense wasn't great and it should have been better and they had some bad games. And we talk about all the reasons. the fact of the matter is, Ryan, you take away the overtime game, and LSU averaged fewer yards per game than Notre Dame did this year. They averaged significantly lower yards per play. Notre Dame was at 5.9. They were at 5.5, which is almost a half yard, which is a big difference in college football. So even with Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Terrace Marshall, and the offensive linemen that they had on that football team, what's that?
Yeah. Thaddeus
Yeah,
Moss, too, I think.
right.
There. Yeah.
Even with the guys on that football team, Ryan, they were still a sub 30 point per game offense. The next year, they come out and they average 48.4 points per game. They scored 37 points in the SEC title game against Georgia. They scored 63 points in the playoff game against Oklahoma. And they scored 42 points against Clemson. And
by the way, that game against Oklahoma could have been a lot worse. They pulled Joe Burrow in that second half pretty early.
They had didn't they have like 49 at halftime?
Something like that.
It was like
he had like
49 or
56.
56. Yes.
I think he had 6 or 7 touchdowns at halftime. It was wild.
In the first half. It was absolutely insane. And so you're talking about an offense that went from, you talk about the leaps that they made in that second year. They went from, I already told you how bad their offense was, 402.1 yards per game, 5.5 yards per play. They jumped up to 568.4 yards per game and 7.9 yards per play. They went up 2.5 yards per play in one season with the same players.
It's wild.
And, but look, you always knew the talent was there. And I've said this before. That's the reason I had LSU as a playoff team that year. I predicted them because you knew the talent. You could watch them play in 2018 and you could see the talent. And you're like, dude, they're wasting this talent. I mean, they're absolutely wasting this talent. And then when you hear that they're bringing in an NFL guy I didn't know Joe Brady from Adam, but a guy that had worked with Sean Payton for 2 years. He was in the NFL. He's going to spruce up the offense and make it more modern. You're like, okay, it doesn't take that big of a leap for them to be a playoff team. And then he made it unreal, and just all worldly. And part of it was all the stars aligned, right? Like he didn't turn Joe Burrow into an elite quarterback. He unleashed Joe Burrow. That's, you know what I mean? Like Joe Burrow's not a guy that didn't have talent and he turned him into a great talent. He's a guy that said, this guy's got great ability. Let's maximize it. He didn't take the receivers and turn Jamar Chase into a star. He unleashed Jamar Chase. He unleashed Justin Jefferson. And that's what we're looking for someone to do at Notre Dame. You've got Audric Estime and Logan Diggs and unleash Chris Tyree, unleash Deion Colsey, unleash Tobias Merriweather in this unit, right? The talent's there. Learn how to use it. And that's what Joe Brady did at LSU. Now, would he come to Notre Dame and they're going to score 48.4 points per game next year? I don't think so. Because, again, you don't have Joe Burrow at quarterback. You don't have Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson at wide receiver. You're going to have a better offensive line and a deeper backfield, in my opinion. And I think better talent at tight end. But the difference at quarterback and receiver is pretty enormous. But you do have a veteran quarterback that can absorb a lot of information. And the one thing, we said this in an earlier show, the one thing I loved about what LSU did, Ryan, it was a far more complex system for the quarterback than it was for the receivers.
Yeah.
And that's important. And so you're going to run different concepts. He was a spread you out, find isolations kind of guy. They didn't run the ball a ton, but they were good at running the ball that year. That would obviously need to change. It'd have to be a little bit more effective. They were at 166.8, average 4.9 yards per carry, but they weren't a very good rushing team the year before. They did jump on about 9 yards per carry that second year. They weren't quite as good at throwing it, but look, 166.8 yards per game with an offense that was throwing for like 400 a game. It's pretty good, actually, because they averaged 401.6 yards per game and still ran for 166 yards per game. Yeah. So to me, I think you look at it, it would be a relatively smooth transition if Joe Brady wanted to take that look. And he would walk into a situation with a pretty experienced group of players that I think could pick up the stuff he likes to do pretty quickly. And that's what helped him at LSU. He had his coach's kid playing quarterback who was going to be a fifth-year senior that could absorb that information. Sam Hartman can do that. Tyler Buckner going into his junior year can do that. And then, of course, you're bringing in two huge high IQ guys in Kenny Minchie and CJ Carr that would be able to fit that as well. So Joe Brady, to me, is a guy that certainly would be a candidate that I think Notre Dame will look at and Notre Dame should look at. The question goes back to what we said, Ryan. Is Joe Brady interested in coming back to college? And that's the big question mark.
It is, because I feel like some people are going to I feel like most people would be really excited about it from a fan base perspective, but some people would look at it and be like, well, he wasn't very good in Carolina. But I think when you just kind of look at that situation, you're going to be like,
Sure.
first year you have Teddy Bridgewater, who we know has his limitations, right? Christian McCaffrey only played a couple games because of injury. And then the next year, he's saddled with Sam Darnold. Christian McCaffrey gets hurt again.
Sure.
And then he's the scapegoat. And then we see Matt Rule
Right.
this year. It's the same story, right? So it was actually Matt
If not
Rule
worse.
as much.
Right.
Yes, if not worse.
Well, and the thing too is, Ryan, the NFL and college football are different animals. I mean, we've seen this before. We've seen Harry Hiestand got fired from the Bears, right? It's a completely different animal, and assistant coaches are often scapegoats for head coaches. I mean, that's why Harry Hiestand got fired, right? So, yeah, it's a different animal.
It is 100%. And I would say this, the one thing that I really do like about Joe Brady is that he's still only 33 years old. It's like, I feel like we've known his name for a long time now. He's 33 years old. He's been around Sean Payton, like we talked about. He's been around a really good coaching staff in Buffalo under Ken Dorsey, obviously at offensive coordinator this year. He's been around some really smart offensive guys. And I feel like sometimes that adversity that he hits in Carolina makes a coach better, right? Like, you understand things when adversity hits, I think, a little bit more. He was still a young guy. I mean, he was only 30, 31 years old. So he's a person that's been around a lot of great people, and he has shown that the injection that he can have into an offense can really take them next level. We have seen that. So, I mean, he would be an exciting he's an exciting candidate for Notre Dame potentially, because he brings a lot of pro elements, but he also brings a lot of understanding of how to utilize players to the best of their ability. And I think that you saw that with the jump that Clyde Edwards-Helaire had in his final year at LSU, with how Jamar Chase obviously took a big step. Thaddeus Moss was a really, productive football player that final year. I think that you've seen that he can really alter his perspective to make players fit into their role really well too, as well. So I think I like that a lot.
Well, Ryan, one thing is for sure, it would be the biggest splash hire that Notre Dame could make. I mean, whether it's the best hire or whatever, we're not making that judgment because like, honestly, I don't think there's a best hire. I think there's several guys that could come here and do a phenomenal job. And we're going to talk about all those guys in the show tonight. So I'm not one of those people that believes there's only one hire and anyone other than that is just not good enough. I'm not someone that believes that, Ryan. But I do believe, however, that there are certain batch of hires that if you can get someone from this group, you feel very good about where you stand. But I think we can say without question that Joe Brady would be the biggest splash hire. It would be the hire that would send the biggest ripple effects through college football, and certainly from a recruiting standpoint. And that's the thing is, I've heard he doesn't like to recruit, but to a degree, doesn't have to work as hard as Tommy Rees did at recruiting. Because it's just like, if you're a receiver, why would you not want to play in that offense? If you're a quarterback, why would you not want to play in that offense? And that's kind of the thing is like the recruiting comes, it's like with Harry Hiestand, becomes a little bit simpler. Other coaches on the staff will get fired if they try to recruit the same way that Harry Hiestand does, which is just pick your guys and go get them and call it a day. But Harry can do that. Other coaches can't. And that's the part of it.
Isn't it such an easy sell to be like, hey guys, I'm Joe Brady. Nice to meet you. Last time I was in college, I helped Joe Burrow become the best quarterback that we have maybe seen in the last X amount of years in college football. Oh, by the way, Justin Jefferson, dude, who is the best receiver in the NFL probably right now, or that Jamar Chase kid that is in Cincinnati that's pretty close to being the best receiver in the NFL. I helped them get there. I did. I was a part of that maturation. I mean, the year before that he got there, not to backtrack again in this conversation, but Justin Jefferson had like 50-something catches for like 800 yards. Like, he was a good football player the year before. But he became one of the best receivers in college football and a first-round pick, in large due to what Joe Brady was able to put into that offense, right? Jamar Chase becomes the best receiver in college football. So you want to talk about easy sells, as if Coach Stuckey isn't making as much, as much impact on the wide receivers in the 2023 class and already on the 2024 class. I mean, can you imagine him sitting down with a guy like Ryan Wingo, for instance, and being like, hey, man, do you want to be Jamar Chase? Do you want to be him? Because I know how to get the guy there. I know how to do that. I look at my track record. I helped make that happen. So I think it's a massive upgrade for recruiting. And, I mean, Joe Cool was my quarterback, man, last time I was in college. You want to be Joe Burrow? Do you want to be Joe Burrow? Come be Joe Burrow.
Right. Well, I'll give this last point to you. Here's LSU's points per game in the 3 years before and the 3 years after Joe Burrow. 28.3, 27.2, 32.4. It was really sub 30 because you had the overtime game. That's the 3 years before. 48.4 in his 1 year, dropped down to 32 the next year, 26.5, and this year they were 34.5. Thanks in large part to 65 points against Southern and then a bowl game, so 63 points against Purdue. So you had a couple games that padded those stats a little bit. So certainly would be a splash, big time splash hire, Ryan.